It's being used to remember Gwen Ifill, whose historic career spanned decades. Ifill quickly became a pioneer for women and African Americans, shattering gender and racial barriers.
Judy and I will be bringing you the news and analysis you've come to trust.
Groundbreaking, history-making, role model. Gwen Ifill was a veteran journalist, best known for co-anchoring PBS NewsHour.
She was a supernova in a profession loaded with smart and talented people.
Her career included stints at the Washington Post, the New York Times, NBC News, and PBS. Ifill, a pioneer for women and African Americans in journalism.
Let me turn this on its head. Because when we talk about race in this country, we always talk about African Americans, people of color. I want to talk to you about white people.
Becoming the first African American woman to host a major political talk show as moderator of PBS's Washington Week in Review in 1999.
I'm Gwen Ifill of the NewsHour and Washington Week on PBS.
And in 2013, once again making history, co-anchoring NewsHour with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff.
And I'm Gwen Ifill. Those are just
the two women, the first to jointly lead a national nightly news broadcast. Ifill taking on the challenge of moderating two vice presidential debates and a 2016 Democratic primary debate.
She not only informed today's citizens, but she also inspired tomorrow's journalists.
While covering this year's presidential election, Ifill was diagnosed with endometrial cancer, but she chose to keep that diagnosis private. She was 61 years old. Here to share their personal reflections on Gwen Ifill are our CNN chief political correspondent Dana Bash, CNN senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson, and CNN national correspondent Suzanne Malveaux. It's great to have all of you here to talk about Gwen Ifill. Nia Malika, I want to start with you because you have this great story about how Gwen Ifill is the person that you wanted to be when you grew up, and so much so you kept a little photo of her on your computer at all times. Tell us about that.
I did. When I was a cub reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and of course Gwen Ifill had worked at the Baltimore Sun, she worked at the Washington Post, she worked at the New York Times, and eventually I had a TV career, so I wanted to be her, and I went to my computer and I printed out a little black and white photo of her that I found on the web, and I taped it to my computer because I literally wanted to look at her and aspire to be her. And that was my daily vision, Gwen Ifill and her career and her success. And I later told her about this.
And what did she say?
Yeah, she said, Nia, that's really sweet, but it's also a little creepy. And that is who Gwen was. I mean, she was very funny, obviously very warm and smart, but she also had this sort of biting sense of humor that we all were sometimes on the other end of.
Yeah, and Dana, you know, sometimes if you believe that timing isn't a coincidence, sometimes you lose people at a time for a reason. Leonard Cohen, Gwen Ifill, very different people, different areas of professional expertise, but also standards in their own way. What is the reminder for those of us in the business and those who watch that we lost Gwen Ifill?
It's so well put, Chris. The highest of standards, to the point where, and also just an intuition, a journalistic intuition that I was always marveling at. And you know, she would do things like I would see her and she would say something about a live shot that I did and note something that nobody else noted about how I phrased a sourcing quote, or you know, how somebody else who I work with reacted to that. It was uncanny. But after that, she would always, to Nia's point, say something hilarious, and with her big, beautiful smile, just light everybody up around her from the inside out. And that was what was so remarkable about her, is that she was so successful and yet so in tune with everybody else around her, especially women. I mean, she was the ultimate you-go girl, whether it was on Twitter or in personal emails or on, you know, or just when you would bump into her. And it was kind of remarkable that she would lead by example, but also by reaching out pretty regularly to people who she respected who are coming up.
Suzanne, I know that you've brought some photos of your friendship with her as well that we're going to put up. Tell us what you remember most about her.
Well, I've known Gwen for 30 years. We worked together at NBC 20 years ago, and she really was somebody who was you could confide in her and tell her about some of the things that, you know, in this business it can be a rough business, and she was always very well prepared and always willing to listen, and always had that warm, wonderful embrace, that hug that she would give you. And I remember it was 2008, the vice presidential debate, and Gwen was getting a little bit of heat, you know, for her book and her role as moderator, and she had fallen and she was in a cast and had crutches, and I saw her from my live shot location, and she was wheeling herself in this wheelchair, and she was just surrounded by people, and I just went running to her, and I kneeled down and I gave her one of those warm, big hugs that she had always given to me, because she was just that kind of person. She was always there, and to celebrate the good times as well. She has this New Year's Day party that she has given for like the last 30 years, and people have grown up. I mean, journalists, artists, people in her home, they just pack her home every year, and it's like a reunion, and people bring their kids, their spouses, their dates, and they grow up going every year to this party. It was last year I brought my daughter, who was 1 year old, brand new, to become a part of that family, that circle, and you've got 20, 30-year-olds who've been there as Gwen's kids, and they call themselves, you know, they're considered Gwen's kids, and I just think it was such an honor that I could have my daughter be one of those
Suzanne,
kids.
on a personal level, her fight with cancer, this was a tough form of cancer. She had tough treatment. I was reading that she went in for a battle. There was a complication, which is often the case with chemo, and she wound up coming out, interviewing the president, like less than a month later. How strong was she in terms of her will to want to live and get through this?
Well, absolutely. I mean, she's a person of faith. She has a very strong faith. She is very close to her family and to her community. She has a sense of family, not only journalists and friends, but everybody who meets her. She welcomes them into the fold. My mom perhaps was her biggest her biggest fan because she represented such hope and what you can be generation after generation. She did not want to share her battle publicly. This was something that happened very quickly last week when she took a turn for the worse and ended up in hospice this past weekend. But she wanted people to remember her resilience, her smile, her courage, and her hope. And if you see it on any of those photos on her face, that is really the lasting impression that she wanted to leave.
Yeah. Ladies, thank you so much for sharing your reflections and the photos. It's great to see all of those happier times, as well as your daughter, Suzanne. Thanks so much for showing us all of that.
The person may be gone, but the example lives on. That's the hope. All right, so the president is getting ready to speak from Greece in just a few minutes. What will his message be? We're going to bring you it live when it happens. We do know the president spoke out sharply against Trump during the campaign, but now he has a different tone. What is the message abroad, and how does he explain it to the world? Next.